Europe isn't just castles and cobblestones, it's crawling with creatures history tried to forget. Beneath the mountains, inside the forests, hiding behind the stained glass and stone, something breathes. From skinless sea demons to whispering house spirits, these aren't bedtime stories. They're warnings, and some of them are still being seen. This isn't mythology, it's a map of fear drawn in folklore. Tonight we follow it, see it, 30 terrifying mythical creatures of Europe. You've heard of a few. The rest, you'll wish you hadn't. Let's begin. Before we dive in, if you love dark folklore, haunted history, and creatures that shouldn't exist but somehow do, hit subscribe and join us for more stories like this every week. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Prague, 3 a.m. in the Scottish Highlands. Let's see who else is wandering through the dark with us. One basilisk in the arid, sun-scorched ruins of medieval southern Europe. Whispers once curled through crumbling cathedrals and plague-ridden alleyways like smoke. They spoke of something buried in the stone foundations, beneath the moss and lime, coiled in a forgotten cistern or chapel crypt, a creature so malevolent it didn't need claws or fangs, just one look, one breath, and your insides would curdle like spoiled milk. They called it the basilisk, no bigger than a snake, said some, the size of a lion, claimed others, but what everyone agreed on, what farmers in Portugal, monks in southern France, and alchemists in Bologna all repeated was that the basilisk could kill with a glance. Not metaphorically, literally. Stone turned to dust. Cattle dropped in the fields. A child caught staring into the shadows would simply never move again. It wasn't just legend, at least not to the people living alongside leprosy and lightning. The Physiologus, a medieval bestiary written by very real monks with very real ink, described the basilisk in meticulous detail, half rooster, half serpent, born from a serpent's egg incubated by a toad or an old hen. In other words, nature's sick joke. Even the church got involved. Priests in southern Italy once sanctified entire wells suspected of housing basilisks. One particularly memorable account tells of a village in Provence where the local friar allegedly lowered a mirror into a dark tunnel, hoping the beast would kill itself upon seeing its own reflection. Whether it did or not is predictably left out of the records, but the well was sealed with holy wax and silence, which might be worse. Science, as usual, eventually arrived late to the party, holding a candle in the dark and muttering about cobras and cobra hoods. Herpetologists have since theorized that tales of the basilisk may have been born from encounters with real venomous snakes, particularly the spitting kind, but that doesn't explain the scorched grass or the livestock found twisted like burnt paper. It certainly doesn't explain why 17th century scholars kept publishing anatomical drawings of the basilisk in medical texts with full Latin captions while continuing to treat basilisk venom as a real component in apothecary inventories. Either someone was lying very convincingly, or they believed what they saw, and it wasn't just fear. There was awe, too. Medieval nobles allegedly paid small fortunes for basilisk bones, usually fakes cobbled together from lizards and birds, but no one seemed to mind because possessing a piece of the basilisk meant power, and power in those days meant survival. But perhaps the most terrifying thing about the basilisk wasn't its breath or its gaze or its origin story involving cursed eggs and infernal roosters. No, the most terrifying thing was the way it always seemed to be just beneath, under the floorboards, behind the cellar door, in the dark places people don't check anymore. Because if a creature could kill you just by being perceived, how would you ever know it was real? More importantly, how would you ever prove it wasn't? Which brings us to another creature sailors swore they saw, but only when it was already too late. One glance beneath the waves, and your ship was gone. 2. Kraken. The sea has always been humanity's favorite contradiction, a symbol of rebirth and destruction, freedom and death, vacation brochures and missing persons reports. But in the icy waters between Norway and Iceland, the ocean wasn't just indifferent, it was hungry. It didn't drown ships, it swallowed them whole. And if you ask the sailors of the 13th century why no vessel returned from certain parts of the sea, they wouldn't mention storms or pirates. They'd tell you about the Kraken, not a kraken, the Kraken, singular, titanic, personal, because this wasn't some generic sea monster with fins and a temper. This was a creature so massive it was mistaken for an island. Sailors would anchor on its barnacled back, light a fire, and cook dinner until the land groaned and slid beneath the waves, dragging the ship, the crew, and the story down into the dark. Some accounts claim the Kraken had tentacles longer than a cathedral and eyes the size of dinner plates. Others said it didn't need to attack Tom, it simply created a whirlpool when it submerged, turning the sea itself into a death trap. But the constant in every version, the sense that it was watching, waiting, and ancient. The earliest written description of the Kraken appears in the 13th century Norwegian text Konungs Skugja, the King's Mirror, a sort of medieval training manual for royalty. In it, the author warns that there are only 2 kraken in existence at any time, because if they were allowed to multiply, they would consume all of the fish in the ocean. Practical advice, a little unnerving, and unlike many mythical creatures that faded into obscurity with the rise of science, the kraken refused to go quietly. By the 18th century, naturalists were still trying to catalog it. Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, briefly listed the kraken as a cephalopod in an early draft of his Systema Naturae. He later removed it, but not before the idea had slipped into the bloodstream of scientific curiosity, because even the skeptics couldn't shake the reports. Shattered ships, deep sea scars, and half-mangled carcasses washed ashore with suckers big enough to wear as hats. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, something strange happened. Fishermen off the coast of Newfoundland started hauling up real-life giants, squids with eyes the size of hubcaps, beaks strong enough to shear through bone, and tentacles that stretched nearly 40 feet. The giant squid, once a myth, was now a fact. But somehow that made things worse, because if one sea monster turned out to be real, what else was lurking just below the edge of sonar? Modern science now speculates that tales of the kraken likely stem from rare sightings of giant or colossal squids surfacing during storms, combined with the brutal imagination of desperate seafarers. And yet, there's something suspiciously precise about how ancient mariners describe those creatures. The way the water bubbled before the strike, the groaning of wood under pressure, the smell of brine and ink, too vivid to dismiss, too recurring to ignore. Even today, entire portions of the North Atlantic remain unscanned. There are trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall, places so dark and pressurized that not even our best submersibles last more than a few hours. And something about that silence, that patient, fathomless blue, still suggests a presence, because monsters don't need to roar. Some just wait, and some, like the next creature, don't even need to move. They just guard forever. If you're still here after the Kraken, you're kind of curious. So before we descend any deeper, hit subscribe to keep the monsters coming every week. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? Are you in Norway at dawn or somewhere far from the sea with your lights off at 2 a.m.? Let's see who's brave enough to keep listening in the dark. 3. Griffin. If you wandered into the scorched deserts or high mountain passes of ancient Scythia and didn't die immediately, you might have noticed something strange scattered in the dust. Not human bones, not quite. Massive bird-like skeletons, claws like spears, beaked skulls with eye sockets deep as fist holes. The locals would have told you to stop staring, that what you were looking at wasn't from any animal you'd recognize. Those were the remains of griffins, and the gold they guarded was not meant for you. Griffins weren't just part eagle and part lion, they were part treasure map. According to Greek historians like Herodotus and Aristeas, these creatures nested near gold deposits in the barren regions beyond the Black Sea. They built their dens from bones and stone and fiercely defended the wealth of the earth. And unlike many mythical beasts, they didn't attack because they were hungry. They attacked because they had a job to do. They were guardians, unbribable, unforgiving. But the legend of the griffin wasn't confined to backwater folklore or campfire teas. No, griffins made it into Greek art, Persian tapestries, Roman mosaics. They stood over thrones, adorned shields, perched on the tombs of emperors. They were symbols of power, but always watching power. Unlike dragons, which hoarded gold for greed, griffins protected gold as something sacred. They weren't monsters, they were warnings. You could dig for riches, but the griffin would dig you deeper. For centuries, historians dismissed the griffin as nothing more than a cross-cultural metaphor, a psychological scarecrow. But then came the paleontologists. In the 1990s, historian Adrian Mayer proposed a theory both absurd and oddly compelling, that the ancient tales of griffins were inspired by real fossil beds of Protoceratops, a dinosaur species with a beaked face, parrot-like skull, and four-legged posture. The fossilized bones were common in Central Asia, especially near gold-rich areas in the Altai Mountains. To an untrained eye, particularly one with a myth-making instinct, it might have looked like a bird-lion hybrid caught in stone. And what creature would nature have created to live among gold? Clearly something divine, or at least dangerous. But even if the bones were real, that doesn't explain the behavior. The stories weren't just about appearance, they were about the griffin's attitude, its loyalty, its rage, its almost moral sense of territory. You couldn't reason with a griffin, you could only flee. Oddly, some medieval bestiaries even claimed griffins mated for life, that they built nests, raised young, grieved, that they weren't monsters at all, but sentient, noble creatures who had simply drawn the short straw of proximity to human greed. Maybe that's why they resonated. They weren't villains, they were the last defense. Today, griffins remain frozen on heraldic crests and corporate logos, quietly watching the money pile up. No one believes in them anymore, but somehow they're everywhere, carved into banks, cast in metal atop mansions, printed on the seals of powerful institutions, always guarding, always glaring. And if griffins once protected the gold buried beneath mountains, the next creature was said to emerge when that gold or anything else was stolen, cursed, or spilled in blood under the light of a full moon. 4. Werewolf. In the borderlands of medieval Europe, where the forests ran deep and the maps ran out, something ancient stalked the edge of human understanding, or at least the edge of the village. The moon was just an excuse. The real transformation, they said, came from sin, a curse, a pact, or worse, from being born that way. They weren't just stories whispered by candlelight. These were documented cases, confessions, if you can call them that, real trials, real names, real sentences. In parts of France, Germany, and the Balkans, people didn't just believe in werewolves, they arrested them, and not for metaphorical crimes. There was Peter Stump, a 16th century German farmer accused of turning into a wolf and roaming the countryside. He confessed, after lengthy persuasion, to having worn a magic belt that transformed him into the beast. He also confessed to a number of other things we won't repeat, but suffice to say it wasn't a good time to be hairy and misunderstood in the Rhineland. But Stump wasn't alone. Across Europe, dozens of cases surfaced over several centuries. In Estonia, they called them Leibehunt. In the Balkans, they were Vukodlak. The terminology shifted, but the pattern didn't. People would swear that someone, usually an outsider, a wanderer, or just someone they didn't like, had been seen prowling on four legs, foaming at the mouth, dragging something into the woods. Sometimes it was a sheep, sometimes it wasn't, and then a few days later, a familiar face would return to town, avoiding eye contact. Now, modern scholars have theories. Ergo, poisoning, perhaps, a fungus that grows on rye and can induce hallucinations, mass hysteria, misidentified animal attacks, or even just social scapegoating wrapped in supernatural fur. But these explanations feel retroactive, like apologies for something no one really wants to explain, because there's something deeper at work here, something older. The werewolf myth isn't limited to one region. It stretches back into antiquity. In Greek mythology, King Lycaon was turned into a wolf after serving Zeus a questionable meal. The Romans told of Versipellis, skin changers. Norse sagas spoke of berserkers who wore wolf pelts into battle and became creatures of unstoppable rage. And none of these stories treated it as just a curse. It was also a release. Maybe that's the part people feared most. Not that someone could become a wolf, but that deep down they might want to. The forest was the symbol, but the transformation was internal. The loss of language, the breaking of social rules, the hunger, the terrifying relief of no longer being responsible for your actions. No taxes, no guilt, just instinct. In a strange twist, some medieval records even speak of good werewolves, guardians who protected villages by night. A 17th century Livonian man named Thais claimed to be a hound of God, sent to battle witches and demons in the underworld during full moons. The judges were unimpressed. Still, it shows how fluid the boundary was. Monster or martyr, beast or protector, depends who's writing the report. Today, the werewolf lives on mostly as a Halloween mask or a movie cliche, but the fear it represented, that the people around you aren't who they seem, that even you might be hiding something monstrous, hasn't gone anywhere. And speaking of the dead not staying where they belong, the next creature doesn't need a full moon, just an empty grave and a reason to come back. 5. Vampire. Before Hollywood dressed them in tuxedos and gave them aristocratic cheekbones, vampires were something far less elegant and far more terrifying. In the dirt roads and fog-choked cemeteries of Eastern Europe, they didn't charm, they clawed, they chewed, they knocked on windows at night, not to be invited in, but to remind you that you were next. The earliest stories didn't involve pale skin and capes. They involved bloated corpses with reddish faces and blood at the corners of their mouths, more like corpses with indigestion than seductive immortals. In Slavic folklore, the vampire wasn't so much a figure of fantasy as a problem to be solved urgently and with a shovel. You see, in 18th century rural villages across the Balkans and beyond, when someone died suddenly, or crops failed mysteriously, or a child wasted away without explanation, the villagers did not call a doctor. They dug up the most recent corpse, and if that corpse looked fresh or showed signs of bloating, or God forbid, had blood in its mouth, they acted. In Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland, archaeologists have found so-called vampire burials, bodies pinned down with iron spikes, decapitated, buried face down, or with bricks shoved into their mouths. These weren't metaphors, these were risk management strategies, because to them, vampires didn't haunt castles, they haunted the neighborhood. Why the hysteria? Some historians blame disease, tuberculosis, rabies, the plague, slow deaths that left survivors grasping for meaning. But others point to something more primal, the discomfort with death itself, a corpse that doesn't rot on schedule, unnatural, a dead person who appears in your dreams calling you by name, definitely unnatural. And if your livestock start dying right after old Uncle Vasil died, well, you start to ask questions. The church tried to step in. In the 1700s, both Catholic and Orthodox authorities issued formal decrees stating that the dead could not come back to life. But that didn't stop villagers from arming themselves with garlic, hawthorn, salt, and iron, nor did it stop wandering vampire hunters from selling their services, and occasionally their own protective amulets, to terrified communities. Even more unsettling, some vampire legends involve no physical corpse at all. Instead, the vampire was a spirit, a restless soul, a person who had died badly or been cursed or simply buried improperly. These versions blurred the line between ghost, demon, and revenant, making the creature harder to pin down and far more adaptable. Eventually, of course, the myth migrated west with the publication of Polidori's The Vampire in 1819 and later Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. The vampire shed its peasant roots and became something polished, stylish, seductive, but buried beneath the silk and candles was the same primal terror, something dead that refused to stay dead. Today, we rarely worry about vampires in the literal sense, but we still talk about emotional vampires, about people who drain us, haunt us, take without giving. The metaphor lives, the hunger remains, and in certain coastal villages of the north, where the wind howls across black waves and winter never seems to end, the fear shifts from what rises in the grave to what crawls from the sea, and sometimes it has no skin at all. 6. Nukkalavi. Even by the generous standards of Scottish folklore, a canon that includes screaming fairies, prophetic severed heads, and homicidal water horses, the Nukkalavi stands out. It doesn't creep, it doesn't whisper, and it doesn't leave you wondering if maybe it was all just a bad dream. The Nukkalavi does one thing: it arrives. And when it does, the land dies. Born from the dark mythic soup of the Orkney Islands, the Nukkalavi is a creature so feared, its name was rarely spoken aloud, a sea-dwelling horror that comes ashore when the wind turns bitter and the sky forgets the sun. It looks, if you can bear to look at all, like a hideous fusion of man and horse, fused into a single skinless abomination. A human torso rides where a horse's neck should be, with arms that drag across the ground, a head that rolls unnaturally on its shoulders, and a mouth that gapes too wide and grins far too often. But it's not the grotesque anatomy that sends fishermen and farmers fleeing indoors, it's the breath. According to the islanders, the Nukkalavi's breath wasn't just foul, it was a plague. It could blacken crops, sicken livestock, and poison wells. And unlike other folkloric terrors that stuck to their own little caves and cliffs, the Nukkalavi liked to wander through farmlands, past churches, up coastal paths, just exploring. Local legends say it's impossible to outrun and completely impervious to prayer, steel, or bribery. The only thing it feared, according to lore, was fresh water, a curious weakness for a creature born of the sea. Some speculate this odd limitation hints at deeper mythological roots, perhaps a leftover trait from ancient Celtic water spirits, beings that could bless or curse depending on which mood the tide left them in. Of course, the Nukkalavi didn't show up in the glossy pages of medieval bestiaries. It wasn't the kind of monster you'd illustrate next to a lion and a unicorn. This was a creature of the margins, of peat bogs and oral tradition, passed down in whispered and warnings from one windswept generation to the next. Children were told not to wander the shoreline after dark, especially in winter when the seas grew loud and the air carried salt and rot. Not because of pirates, not because of tides, because of him. And perhaps most unsettling of all, unlike many mythical beasts, the Nukkalavi had no real origin story, no cursed sorcerer, no tragic backstory, no moral lesson. It just is a thing that hates for no reason, a thing that punishes without cause. In a world that often tries to justify suffering with stories, the Nuckelavee offers no such comfort. Modern interpretations have tried, of course. Some folklorists suggest the Nuckelavee is a personification of disease, maybe even a cultural memory of the Black Death, which reached even the remote islands of Scotland. Others say it represents the devastation of harsh winters or the chaos of nature turned hostile. And a few think it's simply what happens when you live somewhere with too much wind, too much darkness, and far too much imagination. Still, there is something about the Nuckelavee that resists explanation. You can map its legends, you can trace its etymology, but try as you might, you can't quite domesticate it. It remains feral, untouchable, which might be why even now some Orkney locals won't walk the northern shores when the mist sets in and the sea goes quiet, just in case, because the Nuckelavee comes from the sea, but it leaves its mark on your sleep. And speaking of creatures that creep between dreams and waking, the next one doesn't ride a horse, it rides your chest. Bevan, Alp. There's a certain kind of nightmare that doesn't end when you open your eyes. You wake, but the room feels wrong, heavy, pressurized, as if the air itself has weight. You try to move, but your limbs ignore you. You try to scream, but only your eyes respond. That's when you feel it. The presence, sitting, watching, pressing down, a thing with no name. Except in German folklore, it did have a name. They called it the Alp. Not to be confused with elves, though the confusion is understandable. Alp comes from the same etymological roots as elf, but this creature wasn't charming, mischievous, or remotely whimsical. It was a parasite of the night, a dream stalker, a shape-shifting intruder that crept into bedrooms through keyholes and cracks, riding the chests of sleepers until they suffocated or worse, remembered. Unlike the tidy vampires of Eastern Europe or the violent werewolves of the West, the Alp didn't need to be seen to be feared. It needed only to be felt, and that perhaps is what made it so terrifying. You never truly saw it. You experienced it. Victims would wake to find themselves paralyzed, drenched in sweat, heart racing. Sometimes they reported a weight on their chest, or a cold breath on their neck, or the sound of quiet laughter just beyond the edge of consciousness. Others saw dark figures sitting on their bed, pressing them into the mattress. And while the symptoms sound familiar to modern ears, sleep paralysis, night terrors, the Alp added an extra layer, intention. This wasn't just a brain misfiring in REM sleep. This was something visiting you. Alps were said to wear magical caps, known as a Tarn kappa, which granted them invisibility and the ability to pass through locked doors. Take the cap, some said, and you could control the creature. Though good luck keeping hold of something that turns to smoke the moment you touch it. The Alp could also change form, slipping into the shapes of cats, dogs, snakes, or even mist. It wasn't strong, but it was clever. It didn't kill, it fed on fear, breath, and dreams. Interestingly, the Alp wasn't always seen as an external creature. In some traditions, it was believed to be the spirit of a person, someone whose soul wandered during sleep, usually without their knowledge. That annoying neighbor, your cousin who talks in his sleep, either could be an Alp and not even know it. This ambiguity blurred the line between victim and monster, between what's real and what's remembered. The phenomenon was common enough that during the 16th and 17th centuries, medical texts across the German-speaking world listed Alp attacks alongside fevers and infections. Remedies included sleeping with steel objects, hanging mirrors near the bed, or placing shoes facing opposite directions, anything to confuse or repel the visitor. Folk wisdom also advised placing a broom under your pillow or reciting specific prayers before sleep, because in this case, prevention was far preferable to confrontation. Modern science, of course, has filed the Alp under the neat category of sleep paralysis. And yeah, The overlap is undeniable, but the folklore lingers for a reason. Science explains the mechanism, myth explains the feeling, because anyone who's experienced true sleep paralysis knows it doesn't just feel like a muscle misfire, it feels like an encounter with something that isn't quite gone when you finally sit up and turn on the light. And if the Alp haunts you at night while you're safe in your bed, the next creature doesn't wait for you to fall asleep, and it certainly doesn't need to knock. It waits in the forest where trees whisper in voices that sound like your own. 8. Leshy. The forest is a liar. It pretends to be quiet, but it's always watching. The wind sounds like voices. The birds go silent for no reason. And the path you thought you knew, the one you just walked down minutes ago, suddenly isn't there anymore. The trees have closed ranks. The moss looks different. You're not lost. You've been moved. And in Slavic folklore, there's a name for whatever's doing the moving, the Leshy. Not quite a god, not quite a ghost. The Leshy is the spirit, or depending on who you ask, the owner of the forest. It isn't evil in the way we like our monsters to be. It doesn't cackle or curse, but it does enforce its own rules. And woe to anyone who enters its domain without asking first. Descriptions of the Leshy vary, but they follow a general theme: tall as the trees, bearded with leaves, eyes like mossy stone. Sometimes it's human sized, other times it's towering and skeletal, stretching higher the deeper you go into the woods. It can shrink to the size of a blade of grass or expand until its head brushes the clouds. It walks without sound. It casts no shadow. It often appears with bark for skin or antlers sprouting from its brow, and occasionally a crown of mushrooms like some fungal monarch. The effect isn't grotesque, just wrong, familiar and unfamiliar at once, like something wearing the shape of the forest, but not quite convincingly. The Leshy doesn't kill outright. That would be too easy. Instead, it confuses, it misleads, it mimics the voices of loved ones to lure travelers off the path. It rearranges landmarks. It lets you see the road home just long enough to believe you'll make it, then turns everything sideways. But it's not arbitrary. The Leshy is a guardian of animals, of trees, of balance. In many folk tales, it only harms those who disrespect the forest: hunters who kill for sport, loggers who cut too deeply, travelers who spit on the moss or curse the rain. To those who show respect, who bow before entering the woods, or leave offerings of bread and salt at hollow trees, the Leshy may even be helpful: a guide, a protector, a shadow that walks beside you and ensures the wolves keep their distance. Still, helpful doesn't mean safe. Some Slavic traditions believe that a person who vanished in the forest had been taken to live with the Leshy, not dead exactly, but not returning either. These people weren't mourned in the usual way. Sometimes on certain nights, you might hear them calling from the woods, sounding almost like themselves. Almost. Modern scholars, eager to categorize the Leshy, have compared it to nature spirits from other cultures: the Celtic green man, the Greek Pan, the Japanese Kadama. All are guardians of wild places, all are indifferent to human logic, and all suggest a time when nature wasn't scenic. It was sovereign. In a world where forests are shrinking and wildness is receding into the margins, the Leshy feels like a holdover from an older contract, a reminder that once the woods weren't yours to hike through. They belonged to something else, something with rules, something with a memory. And if the Leshy makes you lose your way in the green world of the forest, the next creature offers an escape, but only if you're willing to shed your skin and leave the land behind altogether. 9. Selkie, by the time you realize what you've married, it's too late. She was always too quiet, wasn't she? Always staring out at the waves like they owed her something. She laughs when you ask about her past. She hums songs you don't recognize. You found her on the shore, half drowned, wrapped in something soft and gray. You thought it was fate, but no, it was her coat, and the moment she finds it again, she's gone. This is the story of the Selkie, a seal in the sea, a woman on land, and a mystery in both. From the windswept coasts of Scotland, Ireland, and the Faroe Islands come tales of the Selkie folk, shapeshifters who live as seals in the Hyn, but shed their skin to walk among humans. They are not mermaids. They are not monsters. They are something quieter, sadder, more complicated. The myths almost always begin the same way. A man finds a seal's skin hidden among the rocks, and nearby a beautiful woman, naked, lost, dazed. Without her skin, she cannot return to the sea, so he hides it, marries her. Years pass, children are born, and though she never speaks of the waves, never complains, she is always waiting until one day she finds what was taken from her, and without a word, she slips away. To some, this is just a story about boundaries, about respecting what doesn't belong to you. To others, it's a meditation on captivity, longing, and the difference between love and possession. But to the islanders who told these stories around peat fires and storm shutters, the Selkie was more than a metaphor. She was a possibility. Accounts of Selkie sightings weren't uncommon. Fishermen swore they saw them sunning on remote rocks, their eyes too human, their gazes too knowing. Children disappeared near the cliffs, only for strange seals to be spotted days later, circling the shore and watching the cottages from the waves. Some stories claim the Selkies came ashore only every 7 years. Others say they never truly left, just watched from beneath the surf, listening. Curiously, the legends weren't always about women. Male Selkies appear too, described as impossibly handsome, mysterious, and drawn to lonely human women, especially those married to absent fishermen. In some tales, the female Selkie returns to the sea but leaves behind a child, half human, half seal, who grows up always drawn to the water, never quite at home on land. The sea, it seems, remembers its own. As with many myths, folklorists have tried to explain the Selkie stories with real-world logic. One theory suggests that early coastal people may have encountered Inuit travelers in sealskin kayaks, mistaking them for shapeshifters. Others point to how seals, especially with their dark, expressive eyes and almost humanoid gestures, can easily inspire a sense of the uncanny, too animal to be human, too human to be just animal. But none of those explanations account for the ache. Because Selkie stories aren't about monsters, they're about separation, the line between two worlds, land and sea, human and other, freedom and domestication, and what happens when someone lives in the wrong one for too long. Even now, some coastal families whisper that their ancestors had seal blood, that their love of the ocean, their restlessness, their long silences at the shore come from someone who once walked out of the sea, stayed too long, and returned just in time. And if the Selkie lives between two identities, the next figure doesn't live at all. She haunts, limping through the air in a house made of legs and bones, cackling at your confusion, offering help with one hand and death with the other. 10. Baba Yaga. She doesn't knock. She creaks, she groans, she arrives on a mortar, steering it with a pestle, sweeping away her tracks with a broom made of human hair, or maybe it's birch twigs, depending on who's telling the story. Her house stands on chicken legs, spinning in the forest, turning its back on strangers and its door toward those she's been expecting. And somehow you are one of them. This is Baba Yaga, grandmother, witch, monster, and moral riddle wrapped in smoke. In the dense, birch-laced folklore of Eastern Europe and Russia, Baba Yaga is more than just a fairy tale hag. She's a force, unavoidable, unpredictable, simultaneously terrifying and necessary, a crone who eats children or saves them, a villain who gives you exactly what you need, just not what you asked for. a forest witch whose motives remain forever unclear and whose loyalty is only to the balance between what is and what should be. She appears to those who are lost, those on a quest, those whose fates are teetering between cowardice and courage, and she always tests them. Her house, perched atop enormous bird legs, rotates to face worthy visitors. It doesn't open for cowards. Inside, it's cluttered with ancient bones, dried herbs, strange brews, and whispering skulls with glowing eyes. Yet despite the decor, it's not the house you need to worry about. It's her. Baba Yaga is no Disney witch. She doesn't cackle. She doesn't beg. She judges. She asks questions you're not ready for. If you lie, you might leave in pieces. If you tell the truth, she might help you, but only after terrifying you first. In one tale, she gives a hero a flying horse. In another, she offers a sword. In yet another, she tries to cook the protagonist for dinner, only to decide at the last second that they've earned survival. It's never about the gift. It's always about the test. But here's the twist. Baba Yaga isn't evil, not in the clean Western fairy tale way. She's not the villain. She's the threshold, the one you must pass before the story can continue. In Jungian terms, she's the archetypal wild feminine, the unpredictable chaos of nature and transformation. In simpler terms, she's what happens when you leave the path. Some scholars believe Baba Yaga is a relic from pre-Christian Slavic goddess worship, a forgotten earth deity turned dark by centuries of moral reshuffling. Others say she's simply a narrative device, a plot twist in a headscarf, but that doesn't explain why she feels so real, why generations of children feared her, and why she persists, not as a joke, but as a warning. Because the truth is, Baba Yaga doesn't care about your goals, your dreams, your tidy moral arc. She cares about how you act when you're afraid, when you're alone, when no one is watching but a house that listens to the trees. And the scariest part? Sometimes when you pass her test and she gives you exactly what you need, it still costs you everything. Today she lives on, not in forests, but in fragments. Old cartoons, Halloween decorations, the odd art installation, but scratch beneath the surface, and she's still there, waiting in the woods, in the stories we tell about what happens when we wander too far and ask for too much. And if Baba Yaga represents nature's judgment dressed as chaos, the next beings are something gentler. At first, they smile, they guide, they dance through the trees and rivers and clouds, but like all things that seem too beautiful to be real, they don't always lead you where you want to go. 11. Nymphs. They always appear just before something goes wrong. You might be hiking a mountain trail alone, or drifting along a silent river at dusk, or simply standing in a forest, clearing you don't remember walking into. And then you see her, or them, barefoot, laughing without sound, hair tangled with leaves, eyes reflecting something you can't name. For a moment, it feels like you've stepped out of time, like the world has paused just for you. That's how they get you. Nymphs in ancient Greek lore were never supposed to be terrifying. They weren't monsters. They weren't witches. They were spirits, embodiments of nature itself, dryads in trees, naiads in rivers, oreads in mountains. Their names changed depending on where they lived, but their purpose remained the same: to personify the wild beauty of the world and remind mortals of their place within it, which notably was small. In the earliest myths, nymphs were neither gods nor mortals, but something in between, divine enough to inspire worship, mortal enough to suffer, and people did worship them. Small shrines were built near springs and groves. Offerings were left in caves and at the base of sacred trees. Travelers poured wine on the ground to appease them, hoping for safe passage. And if you forgot, you risked insult. And insult in the ancient world was rarely forgiven. The thing about nymphs is that they didn't need to do anything terrible to be dangerous. That was the trick. They didn't chase you through the woods. They didn't whisper curses into your ears. They just lured. They made you stay too long, wander too far, forget the time, forget yourself. It's the oldest danger in the book, beauty without mercy. In one myth, a man named Hylas, a companion of Hercules, goes to fetch water and never returns. The nymphs of the spring pull him under. Whether out of love or mischief or pure instinct, the stories don't say. In another tale, the hunter Narcissus sees a nymph or his own reflection and wastes away beside a pool, unable to look away. Again, the line between admiration and annihilation blurs. Even gods weren't immune. Apollo fell for the nymph Daphne, who turned into a laurel tree to escape him. Artemis was surrounded by a retinue of fiercely loyal nymphs who, when wronged, exacted revenge on her behalf, sometimes violently, sometimes poetically, always irreversibly. And yet the nymphs weren't evil. They were natural forces given faces and names. They represented rivers that gave life but could flood and drown, trees that offered shelter but also shaded danger, mountains that looked beautiful from a distance but broke bones up close. The Greeks understood that beauty wasn't separate from danger. It was part of it. Modern romanticizations have turned nymphs into harmless forest girls, spinning in flower crowns and whispering to deer. But the original stories were more unsettling. The nymph was never just an accessory. She was the setting itself. The moment you stepped into her world, you played by her rules, and she didn't always tell you what they were. You can still find echoes of them today, in that sudden silence when you walk alone in nature, in the way certain landscapes make you feel watched, in the temptation to veer off the path just because something looks inviting. And if the nymphs blurred the line between beauty and doom, the next creature smashed that line entirely, a roaring, fire-breathing riddle stitched together from nightmares and volcanoes. 12. Chimera. If the gods ever played with spare parts, the result was the chimera, a lion's body, a goat's head growing out of its back, a serpent for a tail, and breath that reeked of ash and sulfur, not from poor dental hygiene, but because it breathed fire, actual fire, the kind that blackens skies and melts courage. The chimera wasn't a creature so much as an insult to taxonomy, an abomination by design. Nature doesn't make things like this. Something else did. In Greek mythology, the chimera was the offspring of two other nightmares, Typhon and Echidna, who together produced the most dysfunctional family tree in classical literature. Its siblings included Cerberus, the three-headed hellhound, and the Hydra, the regenerating serpent with a taste for heroism. But unlike its brothers, the chimera didn't lurk in caves or guard underworlds. It lived in Lycia, in what is now southern Turkey, where it prowled the mountains, scorching the land and terrifying travelers who didn't believe in metaphors. It was eventually defeated, at least according to the PR-friendly version of events. The hero Bellerophon, riding the winged horse Pegasus, managed to kill the chimera by flying overhead and jamming a lead-tipped spear down its throat, which, when melted by the beast's own fire, allegedly suffocated it. Convenient, but the landscape didn't forget. Even today, there are flames that burn continuously from vents in the rocks of Mount Chimera, a real geological phenomenon caused by methane escaping from underground. Local legends say that's where the monster still breathes, centuries after its death. Coincidence? Possibly, but also maybe not. Modern scholars have interpreted the chimera in a dozen different ways. Some see it as a poetic allegory for natural disasters, volcanic eruptions, toxic gas leaks, earthquakes. Others suggest it represents inner conflict, a hybrid monster for hybrid fears. The lion stands for rage, the goat for stubbornness, the serpent for deceit. Combine them and you get a beast that embodies the worst instincts of mankind, stitched together into something unholy and unforgettable. But beyond symbolism, the chimera has always been a mirror, a way of seeing the unnatural in the natural world, of giving form to things we can't categorize. It's no accident that chimera is now a scientific term used in genetics to describe organisms made from multiple sets of DNA, or in medicine to refer to patients carrying cells from organ donors or even their own unborn twins. The concept is still very much alive, just wearing a lab coat now. And that's part of what makes the chimera more disturbing than the average mythical beast. It isn't just a creature you run from, it's a creature you recognize, a patchwork of familiar things reassembled into something deeply wrong. It doesn't stalk, it exists, quietly reminding you that some monsters don't come from outside nature. They come from our attempts to rearrange it. In ancient art, the chimera is almost always shown mid-attack, mid-roar, mid-burn. There is no peaceful depiction, no serene version grazing in a meadow. It is always in motion because it was never meant to sit still. It was born from chaos and built to spread it. And while the chimera is a creature of flame and fusion, the next beast is something colder, quieter, a prophecy on four legs, a shadow at the edge of the world, destined not just to destroy a man, but a god. 13. Fenrir. He was never given a chance. Born of misfortune, raised in chains, and prophesied to kill a god, Fenrir, the great wolf of Norse mythology, didn't start as a monster. He became one because the gods were afraid he might. And when the gods are afraid, they don't negotiate, they bind. According to the myths, Fenrir was one of three children born to Loki, the trickster god, and the giantess Angerboda. His siblings weren't exactly helping his case. Jormungandr, the world serpent, and Hel, the queen of the underworld. So when Fenrir emerged, a wolf cub that grew with unnatural speed and hunger, the gods panicked. He was taken in by the Aesir, watched carefully, and, in a classic move of preemptive control, tricked into captivity before he could become what they feared. They started small, simple chains. Fenrir broke them, then stronger ones, forged by dwarves, blessed by magic. Still, he snapped them like twigs. Eventually, they commissioned Gleipnir, a ribbon forged from 6 impossibilities: the sound of a cat's footsteps, the beard of a woman, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, the roots of a mountain, and the sinews of a bear. In other words, things that do not exist. It was light, silky, unassuming. Fenrir, suspicious, only agreed to test it if one of the gods would place their hand in his mouth as a gesture of trust. Tyr, the god of justice and war, stepped forward. You can probably guess how that ended, with Fenrir bound, Tyr maimed, and an entire pantheon hoping they'd solved their wolf problem for good. But myths don't end at the second act. They wait, because Fenrir didn't stay locked away forever. His prophecy was never canceled, only postponed. The Norse believed that during Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, Fenrir would break free, his chains shattering as the world cracked open. He would run through the 9 realms, devouring all in his path, and ultimately kill Odin, the All-Father himself, before being slain in turn by Odin's son. And here's where things get complicated. Fenrir isn't portrayed as malicious. He's not scheming in his prison, plotting revenge. He's simply inevitable. He doesn't speak. He doesn't beg. He waits. And in that waiting, he becomes something far scarier than a villain. He becomes fate. Some scholars interpret Fenrir as a symbol of wild nature, not evil, just untamable. Others see him as a metaphor for justice denied, the result of punishing someone not for what they've done, but for what they might do. Still others view him as the personification of time itself, creeping forward until even the gods must fall. There's an eerie humanity to Fenrir's story, which may explain why it's endured. A creature raised in fear, bound for the comfort of others, becomes the very thing they feared. The gods called it destiny. But if they hadn't chained him, if they hadn't tried to silence his howl before he even opened his mouth, We'll never know. Today, Fenrir lives on in more than just myth. He haunts literature, video games, heavy metal lyrics, and family crests. His name, derived from Old Norse, possibly meaning fen dweller or marsh wanderer, evokes places we don't go. Swamps, shadows, boundaries between one world and the next. Because that's where Fenrir lives, not in the open, but at the edge of what we think we control. And if Fenrir represents the wolf we tried and failed to cage, the next figure rides without a head, delivering not vengeance, but certainty, a grinning skull raised high, galloping through mist and folklore alike, always chasing, never stopping. Teen, Dullahan, you don't hear the horse, you feel it. A low vibration through the soles of your feet, like distant thunder dragging its knuckles across the earth. There's no warning, no procession, no sound of breath or blade, just a rider, headless, grinning, relentless, emerging from the dark mist that hangs like wet cloth over the Irish countryside. This is the Dullahan, the headless rider of Celtic legend, and when you see him, it's already too late. Originating in Irish folklore, particularly from the west of Ireland, the Dullahan isn't just a ghost or a figure of dread. He's a messenger, a grim courier of the inevitable. He doesn't wander aimlessly. He doesn't stalk. He has one purpose and one only: to announce death, not to cause it, to confirm it, to make it official. Descriptions vary, but certain details are constant. He rides a black horse, sometimes headless like its master, with eyes that glow like lanterns. The Dullahan carries his own head under one arm, a decayed, ghastly thing with a grotesque grin stretching from ear to ear and eyes that never blink. It sees across great distances, even through closed doors, especially through closed doors. The head isn't just a prop, it's the Dullahan's compass. It guides him to the house of the soon-to-be dead. No knocking, no ceremony. He simply stops. And when he does, he calls the person's name, quietly, but with the kind of authority that makes everything else in the world freeze. The legends say you can't outrun him, you can't plead with him, and under no circumstances should you watch him. If you do, he may whip out a basin of blood and throw it in your face, a gesture that doesn't kill you, but marks you. You're not the next to die, necessarily, but you've been noticed, and the Dullahan doesn't forget. In some stories, he carries a whip made from a human spine. In others, he drives a black carriage made of coffins, tombstones, and flickering lanterns stolen from graveyards. Whatever version you get, one thing is clear: he is not a villain, he's an event. Unlike other supernatural entities who punish or torment, the Dullahan doesn't seem particularly emotional. He doesn't cackle or curse. He doesn't offer riddles or bargains. He simply shows up when it's your time, and if your door is locked, he'll still enter, not by breaking it down, but by simply knowing. No keyhole is small enough, no wall thick enough. The Dullahan does not knock. He arrives. Folklorists have debated the Dullahan's origin for years. Some believe he's a remnant of pre-Christian death deities, possibly a localized echo of the Celtic god Crom Dubh, who demanded yearly human sacrifices. Others see him as a personification of the plague or of war, death made visible and mobile, galloping across a land that knew too much of both. Whatever the case, the Dullahan persists. He appears in stories, in Halloween parades, in the DNA of every headless horseman that's come since, from Washington Irving's Hessian Phantom and Sleepy Hollow to the endless film and game reimaginings. But while most adaptations portray him as a violent ghost, the original folklore tells a more unnerving truth. The Dullahan doesn't kill. He simply confirms that killing is no longer necessary, because once he says your name, the story's over. And yet, not all monsters arrive so neatly. Some don't ride horses. They crawl, they slither, they leave muddy trails in high mountain passes and show up in blurry photographs, their bodies stitched together from rumor and regional fear. just long enough to vanish before the scientists arrive. 15. Tatzelwurm in the alpine regions of Austria and Switzerland, where mist rolls in over jagged slopes and time seems to cling to the rocks. There are stories the locals tell in low voices. Stories not meant for tourists or textbooks, but passed from one generation of mountaineers to the next over mugs of something strong and warming, tales of something that shouldn't exist, but might and still could. They call it the Tatzel worm, literally claw worm, though no name quite does it justice. The Tatzel worm is a creature that exists in the cracks between folklore and cryptozoology, between the real and the almost plausible. Described as a stumpy reptilian animal with the body of a serpent or lizard and the face, disturbingly, of a feline, a cat's head on a snake's body, sometimes with stubby legs, sometimes with none, usually no more than 3 feet long, though some reports claim sizes closer to 6, not large enough to be a dragon, not small enough to ignore, and certainly not friendly. The earliest known references to the Tatzelwurm date back several centuries. Alpine farmers, hikers, and woodcutters reported sudden encounters with a creature that moved like a snake, hissed like steam, and, in some versions, emitted a noxious, suffocating breath. It was always described as fast, aggressive, and territorial, not malevolent for the sake of it, just deeply uninterested in human presence. In 1779, a Swiss herdsman claimed to have seen a gruesome lizard-like animal with a cat's face in the mountains near the Inn River. He swore that when he got too close, the creature let out a shriek and slithered into a hole between the rocks. The story made its way into local papers and was later referenced in 19th century naturalist texts, usually with cautious language, the scientific equivalent of probably nonsense, but just in case. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw a burst of Tatzelwurm sightings, often eerily similar in description, despite vast distances and inconsistent communication between alpine communities. One of the most famous accounts comes from 1934, when a photographer named Balkan claimed to have captured a blurry image of a strange creature moving across a snowy ledge. The photo, grainy, unclear, yet unsettling, was published in several European newspapers and sparked a fresh wave of speculation. Skeptics offered explanations, of course: misidentified lizards, escaped exotic pets, mangy cats, even surviving dinosaurs, though that theory never held much weight outside the stranger corners of cryptozoology. But others pointed to the consistency of the reports, the way descriptions lined up across borders and decades, the way locals, people who knew the land better than any outsider, insisted they'd seen it. To this day, the Tatzelwurm remains a cultural fixture in alpine folklore. Wooden carvings of the creature appear in mountain villages. Some towns even hold Tatzelwurm walks or festivals, half tongue-in-cheek, half serious, because belief, like the creature itself, doesn't die easily in places that respect the old stories. There's something uniquely unsettling about the Tatzelwurm, not because it breathes fire or devours villages, but because it almost makes sense. A little too animal to be fantasy, a little too strange to be normal. The kind of creature you could imagine being discovered tomorrow or yesterday. And if the Tatzelwurm represents the strange that still slithers beneath our skepticism, the next creature hides its danger under something much more alluring: beauty, trust, a gentle nicker from a pool of still water, just before the drowning begins. 16. Kelpie. The loch is quiet, too quiet. No bird song, no rippling breeze across the reeds, just water, still black and holding its breath. That's the first sign. The second is the horse. It looks lost, or maybe abandoned, a beautiful thing standing knee-deep in the shallows, coat glistening like wet coal, mane tangled with lakeweed. It turns to you with dark, intelligent eyes, a soft nicker, a beckoning. You think maybe it's injured, maybe it needs help, maybe this is the start of a story you'll tell people later. That's the third mistake. The first was coming near the water. The second was forgetting your boots, because if you touch it, even a single hand on its back, you won't let go. You won't be able to. The kelpie's skin will hold you like glue, like betrayal, and then it will run, not away from the water, but into it. You'll be dragged into the loch's deepest throat, lungs filling with secrets, and they'll never find your body, only your heart, if the kelpie decides to leave it behind. This is no fairy tale horse. This is the kelpie, Scotland's most elegant death trap. Found in the folklore of Scotland, Ireland, and the Faroe Islands, kelpies are shape-shifting water spirits that most often take the form of horses, but not the warm, chestnut-toned steeds of children's books. Kelpies are dark, strange, too beautiful, too still, and always near water. In some stories, they can change into human form, usually as an eerily handsome stranger with eyes too deep and clothes that drip despite no rain. But no matter the disguise, the Kelpie's goal is always the same: to lure, to drown, and to devour. In older tellings, they were said to eat their victims whole, save for the heart or the liver, which would wash ashore as a warning. But often they left nothing at all, just ripples. And yet, for all their horror, Kelpies were never mindless beasts. They were clever, capable of speech, selective in who they targeted. Some legends suggest they punished only the arrogant, children who strayed too far, men who boasted too loudly, or those who disrespected the Lochs. In that way, they were almost moral creatures, enforcing ancient rules of respect between humans and the wild places they trespass into. The myths served a purpose. In remote parts of Scotland, where lochs are deceptively deep and steeped in fog, telling children a flesh-eating horse lived in the water wasn't just storytelling, it was survival advice. Stay away. Don't follow strange things. Don't trust beauty when it beckons from where it shouldn't be. Some folklorists speculate that the Kelpie legend may have originated from sightings of real drowning horses, a tragic but not uncommon sight in swampy terrain. Others think it's a cultural echo of ancient Celtic water deities, demoted over centuries into local cautionary spirits. Whatever its source, the Kelpie has endured. It's evolved. Today, it lives on in sculpture and story. Towering, steel kelpies rise near Falkirk, Scotland, modern monuments to myth, colossal and graceful and slightly menacing. Tourists photograph them, children climb them, and somewhere the real kelpie, or what it represents, watches from under the surface, unamused, because the kelpie isn't about horses or lakes. It's about the lie that danger always looks dangerous, that you'll recognize the threat when it comes, that monsters snarl and growl when sometimes they shimmer, sometimes they smile, sometimes they wait, and just when you think you've escaped the water, that you've dried off and left the drowners behind, something even worse rises from the grave, with eyes that still remember you, with teeth made for second chances. 17. Strigoi. In the quiet villages of Romania and across the Balkans, the dead don't rest. They watch, they pace, they remember, and sometimes they rise. They are called strigoi, a word that sounds like a whisper behind a closed door. Not quite a ghost, not quite a vampire, but something far older than either, something that crawled out of the soil long before pop culture gave us black capes and candlelit castles. A strigoi doesn't need theatrics, just time and a reason, derived from the Latin strix, meaning screech owl or night creature. The term strigoi refers to the restless dead, the unquiet souls who through curse, trauma, or unfinished business refuse to stay buried. Unlike their flashier Western cousins, the strigoi aren't bound to rules about garlic or daylight. They don't sparkle. They don't host balls. They just come back. usually hungry, always angry. Some were said to rise from the grave at night to torment the living, drinking blood, yes, but also whispering nightmares, knocking on windows, and slowly draining life from their former neighbors. Others didn't even wait until death. Living strigoi were feared even more. People born with certain signs, a call over the head, red hair being the seventh child, could be labeled strigoi from birth, destined to one day turn. It wasn't something you chose, it was something you were, something you might already be, which made things complicated. Communities took no chances. Protective rituals were widespread, passed down through generations. Bodies were sometimes buried face down to confuse the dead if they woke. Stakes were driven through the chest, not out of cruelty, but caution. In some regions, decapitation was employed, or iron nails driven into the skull. Salt was placed in the mouth, and in especially feared cases, the body was dug up and burned, the ashes scattered to the wind or buried under running water. These weren't rituals performed in shadowy legend, these were real practices, documented, dated, and in some cases still visible. In 2004, archaeologists in Romania uncovered a burial site where one corpse had been staked through the chest and decapitated, dated to the 18th century, right in the middle of a regional strigoi panic. The grave wasn't hidden, it was deliberate, practical, as though the villagers had simply done what needed to be done and moved on. But what made a strigoi rise? The answers vary. Some said improper burial, others unresolved sin, a violent death, a betrayal, a curse from a jealous neighbor. Even something as simple as dying away from home could do it. There's an old belief that souls who don't know they're dead will continue on walking, watching, needing, until someone tells them or stops them. Unlike the elegant vampires of literature, strigoi weren't usually seductive. They didn't beguile. They didn't ask for permission. They were often bloated, pale, with glowing eyes and jagged nails. But worst of all, they were familiar. It might be your cousin, your neighbor, the child who died last winter. That's what made them terrifying. Not the fangs, the recognition. Today, the term strigoi is often lumped in with vampire mythology, but the creature resists neat classification. It is not a metaphor for foreign fear, nor a romanticized predator. It's the thing that comes back when you haven't made peace with what's gone, a haunting with teeth. And unlike many monsters, the strigoi doesn't always need a grave to rise from. Sometimes it lives next door. Sometimes it's you, waiting, watching, remembering. And if the strigoi drags itself out of the dirt, fueled by hunger and unfinished business, the next creature has no such inner conflict. It dances in the woods, it drinks too much, it howls with laughter, half human, half goat, and entirely incapable of guilt. 18. Fawn, satyr. They laugh at things you shouldn't laugh at. They drink what no one should drink. They dance without rhythm, sleep without rest, and smile like they know something you don't. And maybe they do. Half man, half goat, or sometimes half sheep, half trouble, the faun in Roman lore and the satyr in Greek weren't monsters in the usual sense. They didn't breathe fire or climb out of graves. They didn't even want to harm you, not directly, but harm had a way of following them anyway, or arriving before they did. Imagine a figure with the torso of a man, legs of a goat, cloven hooves tapping through the underbrush, horns curling from a tangled mop of hair, a flute in one hand, a wineskin in the other, mischief oozing from every grin. The satyr didn't arrive with a threat. He arrived with a party, and that was the problem. In Greek mythology, satyrs were the companions of Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and altered states. Wherever they went, boundaries blurred, lines dissolved, rules evaporated. They were creatures of pure impulse, desires made flesh, consequences made optional. The Romans later adopted and adapted them into fauns, linking them to their own rural god, Faunus, and softening their edges ever so slightly, but only slightly. To be clear, fauns and satyrs weren't evil. They didn't lurk in shadows waiting to strike. They were the shadows, bending and flickering in the corners of your vision when you stayed too long at the feast. They were what came after the wine turned sour and the music got too loud, and when the candles burned too low to see who was still dancing. Ancient art portrays them as joyful, leering, laughing. They're usually caught mid-motion, leaping through forests, chasing nymphs, playing flutes, balancing cups of wine with careless grace. But those same images also depict a kind of warning, because beneath the revelry, there's an undertone of wildness, a sense that if you followed them too far into the woods, you wouldn't come back the same, if you came back at all. They weren't just symbols of drunken fun, they were what happens when instinct wins, when the mind checks out and the body takes over, when the rules are left behind and nothing is off limits anymore. In that sense, satyrs weren't just mythological creatures, they were cautionary tales wearing fur and a smirk. But it gets stranger. Over time, especially in later Hellenistic and Roman interpretations, satyrs and fauns started to evolve. They became more complex, less purely chaotic, more tragic. Some stories portrayed them as wise, or at least as capable of wisdom, aware that their own nature excluded them from the human world. They could pass through it, laugh at it, tempt it, but never belong to it. The eternal outsiders, the comic relief with a philosophical aftertaste. In medieval Europe, as Christianity took hold, fauns and satyrs were rebranded altogether. Their horns and hooves were conveniently repurposed into depictions of the devil. The old forest gods became demons, not because of what they did, but because of what they represented. Freedom, nature, pleasure, the body, things that needed taming. Today they live on in art, in fantasy novels, in old fountains playing eternal tunes on stone flutes. But if you've ever felt that moment in a wild place where something urges you to laugh too loud, to step off the path, to stay just a little longer than you should, maybe they're still there, watching, dancing, waiting for the music to start again. And if the faun pulls you toward madness by seduction, the next creature doesn't dance. It devours, giants with appetites larger than reason, whose ruins may still dot the earth, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to wake them. 19. Laestrygonians. When Odysseus and his weary crew made landfall on a strange cliff-ringed island during their cursed voyage home, they thought, briefly, that they'd found peace. A quiet harbor, no wind, smoke from hearth fires curling into the air, civilization. They dropped anchor, sent scouts inland, and waited for signs of welcome. What they found instead were giants, and not the noble kind. The Laestrygonians were described by Homer as towering cannibals who crushed men like insects and hurled boulders the size of oxen from the cliffs, sinking ships with childlike ease. Within minutes, Odysseus had lost nearly his entire fleet. Only one ship escaped. There were no negotiations, no riddles, just violence, swift and absurdly one-sided. But as with most myths, the horror didn't end on the page. The story of the Laestrygonians didn't remain confined to Homer's Odyssey. It leaked into real maps, into regional legends, into stone. Centuries after the poem was written, people began to look around the Mediterranean, especially in Sicily and Sardinia, and notice something strange. Massive megalithic structures, tombs too large for ordinary humans, cave systems with ceilings so high you'd think they were carved for creatures twice our size. Local legends began to coalesce. The Laestrygonians had lived here, or were still hiding there. Villagers whispered about sleeping giants in the mountains, bones unearthed that didn't match any known animal, places where sheep would vanish and the wind would sound like breathing. Of course, scholars today will point out that many of these giant bones likely belong to ancient extinct animals, mastodons, mammoths, prehistoric whales. To the untrained eye, A femur the size of a man's leg doesn't look like it came from an elephant. It looks like the remains of something that once walked upright. Then there are the Nurish, mysterious beehive-shaped stone towers scattered across Sardinia, some over 3,000 years old. They seem too advanced for their era, too large to be practical for human habitation, and too numerous to ignore. Locals sometimes call them tombs of the giants. Archaeologists argue they were fortresses or dwellings, but the idea of giant builders remains stubbornly persistent, not because of evidence necessarily, but because of feeling. The uncanny feeling that something much larger than us once walked this earth, left behind strange structures, and then vanished without cleaning up after itself. In some retellings of the myth, the Laestrygonians are linked to the ancient city of Telepylos, a place that may or may not have existed. If it did, it has long since disappeared beneath centuries of ruin and reinvention, but the name itself endures, scribbled in medieval chronicles, mapped onto uncertain islands, and associated with destruction on a scale that doesn't feel entirely human. What makes the Laestrygonians so disturbing isn't just their size or brutality, it's their casualness. They didn't hesitate, didn't negotiate, didn't gloat. They simply ended lives as easily as a man swats a fly. There was no moral lesson, no tragic backstory, just the cold efficiency of overwhelming power. In that way, they weren't really characters, they were forces, storms in human shape, and that fear of being small, helpless, and completely forgettable to something bigger than us never really went away. We still feel it when we stand at the base of a mountain or a cathedral or a skyscraper built by hands we'll never meet. We still whisper stories about giant footsteps in the hills, about bones turned to stone, about ruins that don't match the people who live beside them. Because if the Laestrygonians once ruled the hills and then vanished, what made them leave? Or worse, what made them sleep? And if those giants once owned the earth's surface, the next creatures claimed its underside, scratching warnings into stone, whispering beneath coal dust, and tapping out messages that no miner ever wanted to hear. 20. Knocker. In the deep veins of the earth, where light fails and breath echoes back as someone else's, there are sounds you do not want to hear, footsteps where no one should walk, whispers in a language you've never learned, and soft, deliberate tapping, not from your tools, not from rock shifts or structural strain, but from something small, precise, rhythmic. That's when the miners of Cornwall and Wales knew they weren't alone. They called them knockers, small, gnome-like creatures who dwelled in the twisting, claustrophobic mines of Britain's most ancient hills. Depending on who you asked, they were either helpful spirits guiding miners to rich seams of ore, or mischievous tricksters luring the greedy into collapses and dead ends. Most agreed they were both, because as every seasoned miner knew, the mine itself had moods, and the knockers were its voice. Descriptions of these beings varied, shaped by generations of coal dust and candlelight. Some said they were about 2 feet tall, with oversized heads, twisted limbs, and eyes that shone faintly in the dark, like wet stone. Others claimed they looked more like aged children, dressed in ragged miners' clothes from centuries past, eternally soiled and soot-covered, their faces unreadable and ageless. A few even insisted the knockers had no form at all, just the sound of knocking, moving ever closer, never visible, always implied. One thing was constant. They were there. Miners treated them with a wary respect. Not worship exactly, but acknowledgement. You didn't mock the knockers. You didn't curse them aloud. And if you spilled a bit of your lunch, a crust of bread, a slice of meat, it was best to leave it in a quiet corner of the shaft. Not because they needed it, because it was polite, and politeness was protection. The origin of the knocker legend is tangled. Some say they were the spirits of dead miners, still lingering near the ore they died trying to extract. Others suggest they were older, far older, perhaps a local echo of Celtic fae, dwarves, or underground deities from a time before written record. In Cornish, they were sometimes called boca, a word that originally referred to a kind of hobgoblin or ghost, later anglicized into knocker by miners who needed something less ancient and more manageable. But the most disturbing part of the knocker legend isn't the knocking, it's when the knocking stops, because in many tales, the knockers served as reluctant protectors. Their taps, if interpreted correctly, warned miners of impending collapses. A sudden silence in the mine, or a sharp change in rhythm, was often taken as a cue to evacuate. And more than a few stories tell of miners who listened and survived when others didn't. These weren't friendly spirits, they weren't fond of humans, but they respected those who paid attention, and the mines paid attention back. During the 19th century mining boom, when English and Welsh miners immigrated to America, especially to the coal-rich hills of Pennsylvania, they brought their stories with them, and strangely, the knockers followed. Reports of tapping, disappearances, and unexplained cave-ins cropped up in the New World, echoing patterns from across the Atlantic. American miners, especially those from Cornwall, continued to leave offerings and observe the old rituals, even when others mocked them, not out of superstition, out of survival. By the 20th century, mechanization and geology had replaced myth, or tried to, but in certain closed mines, the ones no longer profitable, long abandoned, sealed off with rusted gates and warning signs, there are still stories, flashlights that flicker without cause, voices on dead radios, and that tapping, faint and low behind solid rock. It may be that the knockers are gone, a leftover of folklore, a collective psychological trick of isolation, fear, and echo, or maybe they're just dormant, watching from the cracks, waiting to see if we've learned how to listen, because the deeper you go beneath the earth, the older the stories become. And if the knockers guard the underground, the next creature doesn't hide. It howls, it waits in the open, eyes burning like coals, prowling through the English mist as an omen you never want to see and never forget. 21. Black shuck. You don't hear it first. You feel it, a pressure in the air, the sudden stillness of birdsong, a change in light, as though a cloud has crossed the sun. Only it hasn't. You look down the path or across the moor or toward the shadow of the churchyard, and it's already standing there, massive, still, watching. A black dog, tall as a calf, with fur like smoke and eyes that burn red, not glowing, not shining, burning like coals left in a fire that should have gone out hours ago. They call it black shuck, and if you've seen it, you were either very lucky or very doomed. This spectral hound is one of the most enduring and unsettling figures in English folklore, particularly across the misty, windswept landscapes of East Anglia, Norfolk, Suffolk, parts of Cambridgeshire, places where the sea meets the land in long, muddy sighs, and the fog clings to everything like regret. The name Shuck is thought to derive from the Old English skuka, meaning demon or fiend, though locals sometimes softened it to the old shuck, like one might refer to a recurring storm with a sense of tired familiarity. Unlike most supernatural creatures, black shuck doesn't hide in the woods or caves or depths. It walks roads, open fields, graveyards, beaches. It shows itself quietly, deliberately, and always with a purpose. Some accounts say it appears only at night. Others swear it stalks in daylight, its shadow stretching too long behind it. And while the size varies from that of a large dog to the stature of a small horse, two things are always constant: its coal-red eyes and the sense that it is not a creature of this world, but one that has stepped sideways into it just long enough to be seen. What follows varies, sometimes nothing, a simple sighting, and the creature disappears into the fog. A warning, a grim reminder. In other stories, the appearance of Black Shuck foretells tragedy, a death in the family, a storm, a sickness, the sort of events that already feel inevitable until a large, silent dog confirms them. And then there are the violent tales. The most infamous took place in 1577. On a storm-ravaged August day, Black Shuck is said to have burst into two separate churches, first in Bungay, then in Blytheburg, crashing through the doors, killing or maiming parishioners, and leaving behind scorched claw marks on the stone walls and wooden doors, marks that, according to locals, are still visible today. The timing of the storm, the panic of the congregation, the literal fire and brimstone of the incident, it read like a biblical warning, but instead of a demon in wings or horns, it came on four legs and left paw prints behind. Skeptics argue the 1577 story was likely exaggerated, storm damage misinterpreted, lightning blamed on legend, but that doesn't explain the consistency of the Shuck sightings over centuries, nor does it explain why so many unrelated regions in the British Isles have similar stories. The Barghest of Yorkshire, the Gwilgy of Wales, the Maudie Dew of the Isle of Man, all large black dogs, all omens, all with eyes that remember too much. What's most haunting about Black Shuck is its silence. It doesn't howl, it doesn't bark, it just stands there, sometimes beside you, sometimes ahead of you on the path, waiting for you to notice. It doesn't chase, it accompanies, a companion to grief, to change, to endings, not causing them, just walking alongside them. In recent years, folklore enthusiasts and ghost hunters have tried to reclaim the image of Black Shuck, suggesting it might be a guardian spirit, a protector of travelers rather than a predator, a misunderstood myth, demonized by time, but the countryside has a long memory, and so do those who've walked the lanes alone and felt that sudden chill, that shift in atmosphere, that ancient sense that something very old and very aware has just taken notice of them. And if Black Shuck is the specter of things to come, silent and watching from behind hedgerows and headstones, the next creature doesn't wait. It blazes forth with wings of war, banners of bone, and the fire of forgotten battles, born not of the earth or sky, but of myth, heraldry, and human need for monsters on the front lines. 22. Wyvern. It doesn't lumber. It soars. It cuts across the sky like a blade dipped in shadow, its wings stretching wider than a ship's sails, its tail arched like a scorpion poised to strike. You don't see it until the clouds turn blacker than they should, and by then you're only seeing its shadow, moving fast and far too close. This is the wyvern, the dragon's leaner, meaner, and arguably more disturbing cousin. Fewer limbs, fewer rules, and more than enough mythic weight to flatten a battalion. Unlike the classic four-legged, fire-hoarding dragons of medieval and Eastern legends, the wyvern is typically depicted with just two legs, two wings, and a barbed tail. Its silhouette more resembles a bird of prey than a bulky beast. Sleeker, more agile, and far more violent. In heraldic traditions, the symbolic language of shields, banners, and family crests, the wyvern wasn't a noble guardian. It was the beast of war, the emblem of plague, conquest, and raw destruction. The origins of the wyvern are difficult to pin down, mostly because it tends to blur into and overlap with broader dragon lore. But by the time the Middle Ages rolled around, the distinction became clearer in Western Europe. Dragons were creatures of legend, often tied to biblical imagery and chivalric quests. Wyverns were different, more bestial, less symbolic. They didn't hoard gold. They didn't issue riddles. They were weapons, walking, flying, tail-lashing metaphors for death that needed no dialogue. French bestiaries described them as desert-dwelling horrors, winged serpents that poisoned the land they flew over. In England, the wyvern became a fixture of local myth and martial insignia. It appeared on battlefield standards, carved into stone at the entrances of fortified manors, and etched onto the armor of knights who wanted to project an image of ruthlessness, not nobility, not divine favor, ruthlessness. Even the name wyvern carries weight. It likely stems from the Middle English vivere, meaning viper, which itself came from the Latin vipera. So even at the linguistic level, the wyvern is marked not as a dragon, but as a snake, a killer, one with wings and the tail, always the tail. Unlike dragons, whose tails were often just for show, the wyvern's tail was its signature weapon, barbed, venomous, sometimes tipped with a blade or a stinger. In some myths, a single strike could paralyze or kill. The tail didn't just follow the wyvern, it hunted with it. Of course, skeptics and scholars have offered all the usual theories: misidentified crocodiles, Nile monitor lizards seen during trade expeditions and exaggerated by terrified sailors, large birds with damaged wings, pterosaurs even, dragged up from fossil beds and projected into the living world by the medieval imagination. But none of those explanations account for the consistency of the image, the two-legged, bat-winged, spiny-tailed shadow. It appears across centuries, across regions, across mediums, from the carved stones of Northumberland to 16th century English battle flags, from French manuscripts to Polish folklore. Always the same general shape, always the same implication. This thing does not reason, it raises. In more modern contexts, the wyvern has slithered its way into popular fantasy, video games, novels, films, often used to distinguish true dragons from something else, something faster, nastier, and less sentimental. In these stories, dragons might speak. Wyverns rarely do. Their role is to serve as natural disasters with wings, the embodiment of fear from above. And perhaps that's why they endure, because even now, even with science and radar and flight control systems, we still look up at the sky and expect something terrible to descend from it, not just from above, from beyond, from older fears, primitive ones. And if the wyvern is war from the heavens, a heraldic beast stitched into the flags of the conquerors, the next figure is humbler, but no less eerie. It won't fly, it won't chase. It's already in your house, behind the stove, under the stairs, watching quietly and waiting for you to forget its name. 23. Domovoy. There's something in the house, not in a dramatic, creaking floorboard, phantom footsteps way, not even in a haunted mirror, Victorian ghost child sort of way. No, this presence is quieter, domestic, lurking in corners, watching from shadows. The bread won't rise, the fire won't start. Something moves in the attic, not loud, but deliberate. You light a candle, the flame flickers sideways, not because of a draft, but because someone didn't like what you said. Congratulations, you have a domovoy. In the folklore of Slavic Europe, particularly Russia, Ukraine, and the Balkans, the domovoy is the household spirit, a kind of spectral tenant who doesn't pay rent but absolutely owns the place. He is old, bearded, small, often covered in soot. He lives behind the stove or beneath the threshold, rarely seen but always present. And while he's not a demon, and certainly not a ghost, he's also not a harmless superstition. He is family, whether you like it or not. Unlike most mythical creatures who stalk from the outside, forests, seas, graves, the domovoy begins inside. You inherit him with the home, or in some stories, he follows the family from house to house. He's not evil, he protects, but not for free. He expects respect, offerings, and adherence to the unspoken rules of the household. Bread left overnight? Fine, but don't insult it. Fire gone cold? He might bring it back or he might smother it entirely. He's particular, not cruel, and when disrespected, he becomes a problem. The earliest stories of the domovoi come from pre-Christian times, likely stemming from ancient ancestor worship. He was thought to represent the spirit of the original patriarch, the first man to build the home, or in some cases, a symbolic representation of the protective male presence. Over time, he took on a life of his own, becoming not an individual ghost, but a kind of domestic guardian, a spiritual custodian, and sometimes an extremely irritable roommate. To keep a domovoi happy, you had to live properly. That meant working hard, showing gratitude, and maintaining order in the household. The hearth was sacred, the heart of the home, and many rituals revolved around it. Families would leave bits of bread, milk, or even a slice of salted meat near the stove as offerings, not as superstition, as good manners. If the domovoi accepted the gift, the fire would burn stronger. If not, you'd know. He wasn't a distant figure. He was involved. If the domovoi liked you, he might brush your face gently while you slept, a sign of approval. He might warn you of danger through dreams or whisper premonitions into the ears of animals. A cat hissing at the wall wasn't just being strange, it was listening, interpreting. But if he didn't like you, things turned. Tools disappeared, milk soured, plates cracked for no reason. At night, footsteps would echo through the rooms. The air would go cold. Babies would cry without explanation. Not dramatic enough for a horror film, just off, just wrong. There were stories of families being driven out of their own homes by a displeased domovoi, not with violence, but with relentless misfortune. No matter what they did, nothing worked. The house would seem to reject them, and eventually they would leave, only to find peace somewhere else. The domovoi would stay, waiting for new tenants, hopefully more polite ones. Christianity, when it swept through Eastern Europe, tried to fold the domovoi into its cosmology. Some saw him as a fallen angel, others as a benign housebound devil, but folk belief remained stubborn. Too many grandmothers had too many stories, too many old houses had too many odd sounds, and besides, the church didn't have a replacement. Who else was going to keep the woodpile dry? In today's world of central heating and motion sensor lights, the domovoi has become a quaint figure, a kitschy relic. Little statues, smiling and cartoonish, decorate tourist shops across Eastern Europe. But deep in the countryside, in houses that still creak, families still leave bits of bread near the stove, just in case, because some spirits don't haunt. They live, they listen, and if you disrespect the home, your own or anyone else's, don't be surprised when the walls remember. And while the domovoi guards the domestic threshold, the next figure waits beyond it, not in houses, but in the wilderness, antler-crowned and silent, watching from between the trees like the forest's memory itself. 24. Cernunnos. He doesn't speak. He doesn't chase. He doesn't need to. Cernunnos, the horned god of the ancient Celts, watches. That's his power. That's his punishment. A silent observer in a world that stopped believing in him, though the trees still remember and the animals still pause when he walks by. You'll find no long epics about him, no flashy wars, no seductions or betrayals. The myths, as we have them, are nearly silent, whispers carved into crumbling stone, fading images on ancient coins, fragments on shrines left to moss and lichen. A man, seated cross-legged, antlers curling from his skull like living branches, surrounded by beasts, holding a torque, the golden collar of the divine, and sometimes a serpent, horned like himself. That's all. And yet, somehow, he has endured. Cernunnos is one of the oldest and most mysterious figures in European mythology, not because his stories were preserved, but because they weren't. Scholars have only fragments recovered from Celtic and Gallo-Roman artifacts dating back over 2,000 years. He's depicted not as a warrior or a king, but as something else entirely, a presence, the center of the circle, the watcher in the woods. His antlers aren't decoration, they're identity. He is the forest personified, wild, ancient, unknowable. He represents fertility, animals, life, and death, not in the pastoral, sanitized sense, but in the primal way the world once worked before stone walls and crop rotations. Cernunnos wasn't about controlling nature. He was nature, teeth and fur, rot and bloom, the deer that births in spring, the wolf that feeds in winter. The Celts left no centralized mythology, no Homeric epics or edicts. What we know comes through Roman filters, medieval reinterpretations, and archaeological guesswork. The name Cernunnos itself comes from a single inscription on the Pillar of the Boatman, a Roman-era monument found in Paris. But despite this scarcity, his image has resonated through centuries, popping up in medieval manuscripts, reappearing in folk tales under other names, and being resurrected in modern neo-pagan traditions as a symbol of the wild, sacred masculine. But what makes Cernunnos terrifying isn't what he does, it's what he reminds us of. He is the thing that doesn't care about your cities, your gods, your taxes, your declarations of order. He doesn't rage against them, he simply outlives them. He sits in the woods, watching empires rise and fall like the changing of the seasons, and remains, not vengeful, not pleased, just there, breathing with the wind, listening with the leaves. There's a reason he shows up in druidic rites and solstice festivals, in the silent dances of forgotten religions. When you walk alone in the woods and suddenly feel like you're being watched, not by an animal, but by the place itself, that's him. When the hair on your arms stands up at the sight of antlers in a foggy field, not because they're dangerous, but because they mean something you can't quite explain, that's him too. Some modern interpretations romanticize Cernunnos, painting him as a gentle, forest-dwelling protector, a pagan saint of sorts, but that gentleness is a projection. The original figure is neither gentle nor cruel. He simply is. He doesn't offer answers or ask questions. He reminds you that you are a visitor and that the moss under your feet was here long before your name meant anything. You can't bargain with him. You can't impress him, but you can acknowledge him. Step lightly. Say thank you. Take only what you need. Leave no trace, not because he'll punish you, but because he might notice you. And if the forest notices you, you're part of it now. And while Cernunnos waits in stillness, antlers raised like a cathedral, the next beings dart in circles around the sacred hills, see bright and deadly in their silence. They smile with secrets, steal time like pocket watches, and leave you dancing with nothing in your hands but frost. 25. Fairies. They've been sanitized by storybooks, diminished by glitter and wings, by the pastel palettes of cartoons and bedtime lullabies. Today they flit and giggle, living on the edges of childhood imagination, somewhere between a wish and a marketing scheme. But go back further, past the picture books, past the Victorian paintings, past the sugar-coated versions offered to keep children docile. And the truth about fairies is older, stranger, sharper. The fair folk, the good neighbors, the hidden people. These are not your friends. Across Celtic, Irish, Welsh, and broader European folklore, fairies were never harmless. They were powerful, capricious, and impossible to categorize. Not quite gods, not quite spirits, and certainly not mortal. They lived in a parallel world, adjacent to ours, brushing against it in certain places at certain times, often without invitation. If you crossed them, you'd regret it. If you pleased them, you'd never be certain why. Either way, they noticed. The first thing to understand is this: fairy was never a specific creature. It was a category, a kind of catch-all term for a wide, shifting range of beings, from towering forest guardians to whisper-thin tricksters, the Aos Sea of Irish lore, the Tylwyth Teg in Wales, the Seelie and Unseelie courts of Scotland, some beautiful, some grotesque, all unpredictable, all bound by rules they never bothered to write down for your convenience. You weren't supposed to see them. And if you did, you pretended you hadn't. Fairies lived underground, beneath the green hills and ancient barrows, the she-mounds, where the earth opened into their realm. People feared building near them. Plowing over them was a gamble with your entire bloodline. Roads would twist around these mounds, cottages built just slightly off center to avoid disturbing the invisible borders. It wasn't superstition, it was etiquette. And then there were the fairy rings, perfect circles of mushrooms or grass pressed flat by invisible feet. Stepping inside them meant time distortion, disorientation, sometimes disappearance. A traveler might return hours later, or days, or never, or they'd return centuries later, confused, unchanged, and no longer welcome in their own world. The lesson was simple. If something in nature looks too perfect, you don't touch it. It's not that fairies were always cruel, it's that they had different values, different ideas of fairness. They hated rudeness, even when unintentional. They demanded respect, but not flattery, gifts, but not offerings, attention, but not direct eye contact. You had to know the right way to speak of them. Never fairy, if you could avoid it. That was like calling a noble by their first name in a whispering court. You said the good folk, the gentry, those who walk at twilight. They'd visit homes uninvited, borrow things, rearrange, sometimes help if they liked the family, sweeping the hearth, braiding the horses' manes, blessing the butter. But more often they punished carelessness. Children were switched for changelings, sickly, shriveled things that cried all night and stared too intently. Cows dried up, milk spoiled, laughter vanished from the dinner table, and no one could explain why. The solution wasn't revenge. You couldn't fight the fair folk. You could only appease them. Leave bread and milk by the doorway. Turn your clothes inside out to confuse them. Never whistle at night. Never thank them directly. Never speak ill of them, even in jest. Some folklorists interpret the fairy myths as echoes of older, pre-Christian deities, downgraded over time, transformed from gods into forest tricksters. Others see them as warnings against wandering too far from the village, too deep into the woods, too close to the edges of understanding, because those edges, like fairy paths, are tempting and dangerous. Today they've been turned into toys, mascots, decorations, but in the old places, in corners of Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, and the Highlands, there are still stories, still small offerings on windowsills, still hedgerows that no one dares cut, not because anyone's sure the fair folk are real, but because you only need to be wrong once. And if the fairies tempt with illusions and vanish when named, the next light you see in the dark may not be a trickster at all. It may be a lure, cold, blue, and floating just beyond the safe path, not a creature, but an invitation, and not all who follow it come back. 26. Will-o'-the-wisp. It's just a light. That's what you tell yourself. A pale blue flicker in the fog. Soft, gentle, almost inviting. It hovers just above the bog water, or beyond the tree line, or near the edge of a crumbling stone wall that no one remembers building. You see it just for a second, and then it's gone, but not far, just out of reach, just far enough to make you wonder what it was, and who else might be out there. Then you step off the path, and the earth gets softer beneath your feet. Across Europe, from the marshlands of England to the peat bogs of Ireland to the swamps of Scandinavia, the phenomenon is known by many names: will-o'-the-wisp, ignis fatuus on foolish fire, spunky in Scotland, Elielden in Wales, jack-o'-lantern in older English dialects. The names change, but the image remains the same: a ghostly light that dances through wetlands, leading travelers astray, always appearing at twilight or night, always just ahead, always fading as you chase it. The modern mind wants to explain. It's a chemical reaction, they say. Gases like methane and phosphine released from decaying organic matter, spontaneously igniting upon contact with the air. Scientific, predictable, comforting. But no one chases methane into the woods at midnight. No one follows a swamp gas flicker, believing it's a lost child with a lantern or a guide through the mist. And yet, people have followed these lights for centuries into rivers, over cliffs, deep into moors where the air gets thick and the way home forgets you ever existed. In the old tales, the will o' the wisp wasn't just a phenomenon, it was a presence, a spirit, a trickster, sometimes the soul of a sinner, condemned to wander the earth with only a lantern to light their way. Sometimes a fairy in disguise, other times a fragment of an older force, something elemental, neither good nor evil, but deeply disinterested in your survival. It never speaks. It doesn't threaten. It just leads. And the deeper you follow, the less the world seems to care. There are countless folk stories of travelers lost to the light. A farmer returning home from market sees a glow on the moor and thinks it's his neighbor's lantern. He veers off the path. The ground softens, his cart disappears, so does he. Later they find a wheel, a bag of oats, never the farmer. Children were warned never to follow lights at night, not just for the practical dangers of open water and soft ground, but because the lights had intent. If you ran toward them, they ran faster. If you ignored them, they circled back. It wasn't a matter of physics, it was personal. And there's a disturbing twist. In many stories, the will o' the wisp doesn't lead you astray out of malice. It's lonely. It wants company. It wants you to join it, not to kill you, but to keep you, to turn you into another light in the fog, another flicker waiting for someone else to lose their way. That idea that the light is a former traveler is one of the oldest parts of the legend. The sinner who misled others in life, doomed to wander with false guidance forever, or the soul of someone who died in confusion, trying to help but no longer remembering how. In that version, the will o' the wisp is a warning not to lose yourself, not to stray from the path, not to believe that every light leads home. Today, the phrase lives on as a metaphor. We say someone's chasing a will o' the wisp when they pursue an illusion, a false hope, a dream that fades with every step. But the folklore never called it a dream. It called it real. It called it dangerous. It called it yours. Says, if you weren't careful, and if the will o' the wisp drifts silently through the fog, drawing wanderers into its orbit, the next figure charges headlong, howling, wide-eyed, consumed by a fury no light could ever catch. Not a spirit, not a legend, a man in a beast's skin, tearing through the battlefield with a mind already half lost. 27. Berserker. There are warriors, and then there are storms dressed as men. In the frozen north, long before history was written in ink, before battles were strategized with maps and mathematics, there were those who fought without armor, without fear, and without any trace of the human hesitation that keeps most people alive. They were the berserkers, Norse warriors so consumed by rage, by ritual, by something, that they seemed less like men and more like beasts pretending to be human just long enough to break the world open. The word berserker comes from the Old Norse berserker, and the meaning is debated. Some say it means bear shirt, referring to the bear pelts they were believed to wear. Others say it means bear shirt, fighting without armor, and exposed to blade and arrow without concern. Either way, the message is clear. They didn't need protection. They were the danger. Unlike the carefully ranked soldiers of Rome or the disciplined shield walls of medieval Europe, berserkers were chaos incarnate. They were said to charge into battle, frothing at the mouth, biting their shields, eyes wide and empty. Arrows didn't slow them, swords bounced off them. They felt no pain, no fear. They were, as the sagas put it, mad as dogs or wolves, sometimes stronger, often faster, and absolutely terrifying. But this wasn't just adrenaline, or at least it wasn't only that. Some modern historians believe berserkers entered their battle trance through ritual, intense drumming, chanting, fasting, or even consuming hallucinogenic substances like Amanita muscaria, a psychoactive mushroom native to the region. The theory goes that these warriors would induce an altered state, one that disconnected them from their own bodies and allowed them to fight as if they were already dead, or at least no longer concerned about staying alive. Others suggest the frenzy was psychological, a culturally reinforced state of controlled possession. The Norse believed deeply in shape shifting and animal spirits. To become a bear, a wolf, a wild boar, this wasn't metaphor, it was transformation. In some sagas, berserkers were considered ulfhednar, wolf coated, warriors who channeled the essence of the animal into themselves. They didn't just wear the beast, they became it, and the transformation didn't stop on the battlefield. In many tales, berserkers were dangerous off the field as well. Volatile, uncontrollable, sometimes cursed, they were both revered and feared, even by their own people. Kings employed them as shock troops or bodyguards, but often kept them at arm's length because once the bloodlust wore off, once the fog lifted, what was left behind wasn't always fully human anymore. Rage leaves residue. Over time, as Christianity spread through the Norse world and violence became something to be managed rather than venerated, the berserker became a problem. Laws were passed to restrict berserk gang, the battle madness. It was no longer seen as divine fury, but dangerous madness, a liability in a society trying to build kingdoms rather than raid them. Still, the stories remained. The image endured, a man who could shrug off blades, tear through shield walls, and look death in the eye without blinking. A man who became something else when the horn sounded. Today, the word berserk has been diluted, used for toddlers and tantrums or computers that won't shut off. But in the original context, it was something sacred and terrifying, a human choosing to step out of his own skin and into the mouth of the beast, not because he had to, but because it was the only way to win. And if the berserker became beast through ritual and rage, the next figure never needed to become anything. It was already stone, already monstrous, already watching from the walls above, waiting for the storm, the lightning, the moment it could move again. 28. Gargoyle, you've seen them, perched on cathedrals, hunched over rain-slicked rooftops, jaws open in eternal scream. They stare down from Gothic towers and spires with twisted faces, half animal, half demon, all menace. You assume they're just decoration, architecture with attitude, something dramatic to justify the pointy bits. But what if they weren't just there to scare away pigeons? What if they were watching? Gargoyles are one of Europe's strangest architectural traditions, grotesque, winged creatures sculpted into the stonework of churches and castles across France, Germany, Italy, and beyond. Their original function was humble. They were designed to channel rainwater away from buildings, spitting water from their open mouths so it wouldn't erode the mortar. The word gargoyle itself comes from the French gargouille, meaning throat or gullet, the same root as gargle, and yet we gave them faces, not noble lions or charming cherubs, but nightmares, screaming monkeys, contorted demons, beasts with bat wings and wolf jaws and clawed fingers, things no one would ever confuse for angels. And we didn't just tolerate them, we put them on churches, holy places, supposed sanctuaries, which raises the question, why would a place meant to ward off evil be covered in monsters? The answer, as always, is layered. Some believe the grotesques were meant to scare off real demons, architectural apotropaics, like a guard dog made of limestone. Others say they were designed to remind churchgoers of sin, of damnation, of what waits outside the light of salvation, a visual warning, a stone sermon. This, they seem to say, is what lurks just beyond. But the legends don't stop at metaphor. Folklore tells of gargoyles that moved when the moon was high, that flew from church roofs during storms to battle evil spirits, that came to life during fires or sieges, protecting the buildings they perched on. In one tale from medieval Paris, a priest claimed that during a lightning strike, a gargoyle opened its mouth, not to spit rain, but to scream. The next day, the cathedral's interior was untouched, while the buildings around it burned. Coincidence, the skeptics said, just another storm, but others whispered that the stone had listened. There's also the unsettling theory that gargoyles were not meant to protect, that they were watching the faithful as much as warding off spirits, that they served as the church's eyes in the sky, peering down at the villagers, a constant reminder that judgment is never far away. Even stranger, some gargoyles don't follow the rules of the church at all. You'll find them carved in impossible poses, mocking clergy, baring teeth and other things, frozen mid-laughter. It's as if the stonemasons slipped in their own heresies, encoded into the very walls of worship. A rebellion in plain sight, immortalized in granite. Today, gargoyles are mostly decorative, relics of a darker, more symbolically charged era. We photograph them. We put them in movies. We sell plush versions to tourists, but the fear they once held hasn't vanished. If anything, it's just shifted because deep down, we still understand the logic. The monsters don't live outside the church. They perch on it. They watch the faithful come and go. They grin down at the living, unblinking, unchanging. And while the gargoyle is rooted in stone, bound to the rooftops of Europe's haunted grandeur, the next creature is far smaller, stranger, wilder. It hides not in heights, but in the twilight brush of Germany's forests, part bird, part deer, part prank, part prophecy, and entirely inexplicable. 29. Elwitrich. You don't go hunting the Elwitrich to catch it. That's not the point. You go for the ritual, the laughter, the chase, the moment just after twilight when the hills of Germany's Palatinate region begin to hum with insects and rumor, and someone hands you a sack and a lantern and tells you, there, it ran that way. Of course, you never find it. You never even see it. But the hunt continues year after year because the Elwitrich isn't just a creature, it's a shared hallucination that became tradition. Described as a small, flightless bird with the scales of a reptile and antlers like a young deer, the Elwitrich is an anomaly by design. It's not meant to make sense. It's meant to be barely believable. Just enough animal logic to make you wonder. Just enough absurdity to make you laugh. It lives, allegedly, in the woods and vineyards of southwestern Germany, where it's said to be shy, nocturnal, and easily startled, which is probably for the best, because if it were real, it would be terrifying. The origin of the Elwitrich is murky. Some folklorists believe it began as a satirical invention, a kind of rustic joke meant to poke fun at urban visitors who were too eager to believe country myths. Locals would organize elaborate hunts, sending gullible city dwellers into the dark woods with burlap sacks and lanterns, telling them to wait quietly until the Elwitrich ran by. Of course, no one ever caught one. That wasn't the point, but over time the joke took on a life of its own. Statues were built, festivals began, Elwitrich nests appeared in the forests, handcrafted, filled with wooden eggs, and what began as a prank transformed into something closer to folklore. It wasn't just a gag anymore. It was a local cryptid, a symbol, a mascot. Descriptions of the creature grew increasingly strange. Some said it could mimic human speech. Others claimed it could vanish entirely when threatened. In one variation, the Elwitrich is only visible to those who've been tricked before, as if it marks you with a kind of folkloric guilt. Once fooled, forever haunted. There are theories, of course, that the creature is a garbled memory of extinct species or an amalgamation of known animals distorted by moonlight and imagination, that the scaly feathers and antlers are metaphors, symbols of the strange mix of natural beauty and absurdity found in the German forests. But those theories don't explain why everyone who goes looking for one comes back smiling, empty handed but entertained, maybe a little less sure of what's real. In that way, the Elwetreach represents something rare in the world of myth, a creature born not from fear or caution, but from communal absurdity, a shared invitation to not know something and to enjoy the not knowing. It doesn't threaten, it doesn't warn, it simply delights in being uncatchable. But every light-hearted tale casts a longer shadow, and just beyond the Elwetreach's playful trails, there is something older, something colder, a figure from Germanic and Austrian folklore that doesn't invite laughter, only silence. And if she visits, it's not to play. It's to press her weight into your chest while you sleep. 30. Druid. She doesn't creak the floorboards. She doesn't scream. She doesn't shatter windows or hover at the foot of your bed. She sits right on your chest, quietly, invisibly, waiting for you to wake up, but not all the way. Just enough to feel her presence, just enough to try to move and fail, to scream and find no sound. That's when you know the Druid has come. In Germanic and Austrian folklore, the Druid is a night demon, a female spirit associated with nightmares, sleep paralysis, and suffocation. She isn't a hallucination or a ghost or a cautionary tale. She's a certainty, a thing that happens to the most ordinary of people in the most familiar of places, their own bed. Unlike many folkloric figures, the Druid doesn't change form or motive. She is consistent. She comes at night. She immobilizes. She terrifies. And then she leaves, but never without leaving a mark, not on the body, but on the memory. Those who felt her presence don't just talk about fear. They talk about certainty, that someone, something, was there. Historically, the Druid was often associated with witches or thought to be a witch's astral form. In some interpretations, she wasn't a demon at all, but a person, unknowingly or intentionally projecting herself into others' dreams. In others, she was a separate entity, one of many Alp-like beings who visited sleepers, particularly in winter, when the nights were long and the silence too heavy. The word Druid itself has roots in Old High German, possibly linked to Dru, a term associated with harmful female spirits. She appears in medieval grimoires and early modern German demonology as part of a whole category of nocturnal tormentors. But while other entities faded into obscurity or were absorbed into Christian reinterpretations, the Druid remained stubbornly distinct. Not evil in the cosmic sense, just close, personal. People tried to stop her, of course. Folk remedies included sleeping with a knife under the pillow, placing shoes facing opposite directions under the bed, or hanging iron tools near doorways. In some villages, people placed bundles of straw next to their beds to trick the Druid into sitting there instead. Others wore Druidenfuss charms, five-pointed stars used to ward off her presence, but nothing worked forever. Modern science calls it sleep paralysis. The overlap is undeniable. The sensation of waking but being unable to move, of pressure on the chest, of a sinister presence in the room. It's a recognized phenomenon, studied and dissected, attributed to the brain's misfiring transitions between sleep stages. But science doesn't explain the consistency of the stories. Across regions, centuries, cultures, the same presence, the same pressure, the same awareness. The Druid isn't just a superstition. She's a reminder. That vulnerability doesn't require ghosts or monsters, jurts, or dark magic. Sometimes it arrives as the weight of your own fear, personified, historicized, and given a name whispered across generations, from the black forests of Austria to the winter hearths of Bavaria. And if the Druid leaves you breathless in your bed, paralyzed under the weight of your own unease, she marks the final threshold of our journey, a descent through Europe's darkest folklore, from beast to spirit to dream. But the mysteries, of course, don't end here. They never do. They simply return to the shadows, waiting for someone else to wander off the path